Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In our study of the subject of stylistics, we have reached to the part where we would finally embark upon the analysis of the literary works. As throughout the course, our focus had been on understanding what is stylistics and how a stylistician performs an analysis which is different from the analysis of a literary critic. That the stylistic analysis must not be based upon the personal judgments or opinions. Rather, it must be substantiated with the help of the evidence of the features found in the text. We looked at all the aspects of stylistics, ranging from the study of literary writing as a discourse or as a literary piece, to the study of literary piece from the perspective of a linguist as well. That how various elements of language are used to enhance the form and how they really have an impact upon the meaning of a text. Now, when we looked at stylistics as a discipline or a subject that incorporates the understanding of a linguist as well as the understanding of a literary critic, we looked at all those aspects which language encompasses and also those aspects which a literary writing focuses on. Then we moved on to understand the importance of formalist criticism in the analysis of stylistic analysis of any literary piece. And the understanding of the formalist approach highlighted to us the significance of the theories of foregrounding. We looked at the major theory of foregrounding and explored its various aspects like deviation and parallelism. We looked at the significance of interpretation in literary writings, that how, keeping in view the importance of foregrounding, we are supposed to identify the features which are the foregrounded features or irregular features, which we may not come across in ordinary speech and writing, and how literary writing is distinguished on the basis of its literariness that is added through the feature of foregrounding. Similarly, we identified parallelism and deviation as two modes or ways through which a writer foregrounds something in literature. In our study of parallelism and deviation, we further explored what are the literary devices or figurative devices which are there at the disposal of an author who can make use of these devices to foreground something in a text and to add to the literariness of a work. In the understanding of parallelism and deviation, we explored schemes and tropes. We identified schemes with parallelism, as parallelism is regularity, order, balance within writing that is achieved through the use of schemes or different figures of repetition, which may include figures involving repetition of sound, also which may involve figures involving the repetition of words. Then how repetition may also be associated with the creation of identity and contrast. In our understanding of the deviation, we looked at tropes as devices or figurative features which a writer uses in order to break the rule, in order to change the meaning, which must amaze the reader, surprise the reader, and create the interest of the reader in the text. So deviations are used for the purpose of surprising the reader and for the sake of making the reader take more interest in writing. Now, deviation and parallelism can be created with the use of schemes and tropes, and there are many ways that the writers can choose from the devices which are either the ones belonging to schemes and the ones belonging to the realm of tropes. Now, with this understanding, we have been able to understand the very significant and minute aspects of literary writing. We can pinpoint for something like a metaphor or a simile to be a scheme or a trope or a figurative device, or as deviation or foreground feature or irregularity in a text. Now, in this way, we looked at how the syntax is created in the work. We also looked at how narrative perspective or persona helps us in understanding the meaning or conveying the idea to the reader. Now, today we will start with our practical work about our study and analysis of literary works, we are supposed to bring all that knowledge and understanding that we have gained in the previous lectures to apply it on the literary text in order to gain understanding, in order to perform the analysis. So all our efforts and exercises up till now were meant to lead us to this stage where we will be quite apt and we will be quite familiar with the use of understanding as well as analysis of the devices in the exercise of the literary analysis. Now, today we will analyze a poem from a stylistician's orientation, keeping in view the fact that how is a stylistic analysis different from an ordinary analysis. You, as a student of literature, would have been performing analysis of poetry in the form of giving explanation of given lines, like doing sort of analysis like which starts mostly with the context and reference to the context, and then description of the very lines which are given to you in exam or in an assignment. Now, those analyses usually, as we earlier also time and again have mentioned, that those analyses were mostly focused or based upon analyzing the theme of a stanza or a poem. Hardly would we touch the aspect of style or form of poem. So this is how the stylistic analysis differs from an ordinary or a layman's analysis. Now that we know what schemes and tropes are, what is foregrounding, what is deviation and parallelism, how is the syntax or persona or the setting utilized or used in a poem, and how does the form connect with the meaning of a work. Our knowledge of these aspects would allow us or enable us to perform a more rigorous and scientific analysis that will be more interesting as well as detailed. So let us begin with our reading of the poem. That is what we will be analyzing in today's lesson. The poem that I have selected for the sake of analysis and to apply all those theories and definitions about stylistics and its various aspects is "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night" by Dylan Thomas. Let us first read the poem and understand what type of a poem it is. How does it affect us orally? When we read it out, how does its lyrical quality, its rhyme, its rhythm, its syntax and meter affect upon us? And what overall understanding or message do we get from its single or first reading? Dylan Thomas's "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night." Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the day. Though wise men at their end know dark is light, right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by crying, how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late, they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Now, this poem consisting of 5 stanzas, and it comprises of 14 lines. But look at the composition of the stanzas and the lines, that each stanza comprises of 3 lines rather than 4. Now this form in which each stanza comprises 3 lines and the whole poem consists of 14 lines is referred to as a form of a poem or a form of a lyric. That this lyric is referred to as villanelle. Now the very definition given to this sort of a poem, that is a lyrical poem, but each stanza comprises of 3 lines, is referred to as a form of poem that is referred to as villanelle. Now when villanelle is read, you could really understand its lyrical quality, its rhythm, its rhyme, its balance, its meter, which was very soothing and comforting to the ear. But look at the idea, that is of death. That is very much grave, serious, and even horrible too. Now look at the contrast and the irony that the form and the message or the subject matter of the poem contains. The form of the poem is pretty simple and soothing, or like a lyric, quite pleasant to the ear. But the thought that this villanelle or lyrical poem presents is not as comforting as its form or style, because the author talks about death. So this poem is written by Dylan Thomas, who is famous for writing very forceful, passionate lyrics. And as we see the poem, we see that its true importance lies not in its frame or its form, but in its raw power of the emotions that underlie it. As the words rage, rage against the dying of the light, rage, rage against the dying of the night, all these words carry emotional intensity and a force. So the initial reading of the poem leaves an impression that the poet or the speaker is asking somebody not to give up before death. Now that is what is the main idea or the main subject that we distill or get through the poem. That do not go gently to that good night, and old age should burn and rave at close of day. Close of day as looked at as death. Rage, rage as if it's been asked that to take arms against death and fight against it or shoot it. Then he talks about wise men, good men, wild men, all having the same end, that is meeting death, and then eyes getting blind, and then dying of the light, and then the idea of good night, which is death. Now, anyone who reads the poem would understand that the poem is about the idea of death. That is inevitable, that is something that snatches pleasure, youth, and life from us. Now, this is a very superficial or initial understanding of what the poem is about. As form of poem, we identified it as a lyric, and within lyric, we further identified it as a form of lyric that is referred to as villanelle, comprising of 3-lined 5 stanzas. And as the subject matter of the poem, we identified that death and measures against death is the subject matter or the theme of the poem. But this understanding and analysis about the poem is not enough from the perspective of a stylistician, because it is something that a literary critic can distill or explain about the poem. Now that we have been trained to identify certain stylistic elements which are literary as well as linguistic elements, we are supposed to go into the detail of each and every word, focusing on the syntax, focusing on the morphological, phonological patterning of a text, as well as its graphology, as well as its use of symbols, metaphors, conceits, or euphemism, puns, or all sorts of devices which might be belonging to the category of parallelism or deviation. Now, as far as a few or more aspects are concerned about the poem, you have to also look at the speaker, who the speaker is, or the persona of the poem, what we discussed in the last lecture also. And apart from that, look at the setting as well. Where does the action take place? What is the situation in the poem? Where is the speaker? At which particular point in life or at which particular place in the world he exists now while the poem is written or expressed. Apart from setting and the identification of the persona or the voice, we are also supposed to look at the tone and mood of the poem. Now that is another aspect that comes into work when we are performing a stylistic analysis of a work, that we have to look at its tone, its mood. Now, how is the tone or mood determined? Of course, the words would identify which particular mood or tone does the speaker present through the poem. The mood might be generally, or the tone might be generally classified as maybe happy, gay, or optimistic, or generally it may also be referred to as something that is pessimistic, gloomy, or exasperating. Now, these are the possibilities which are available, but for this particular poem, we see there is a certain rage and the idea of anger, frustration within the speaker's tone and mood. So, the words and expressions determine the mood of the speaker as well as the tone of the poem. Whether it is sarcastic, humorous, whether it is filled with frustration, anger, or scorn, or loathsome. Now, these are the many ways in which you can describe the tone of the poem and the mood of the speaker. So we will also identify, along with the speaker or the narrative voice, the mood, the tone, and the setting of the poem. Then another important aspect that we are supposed to look at is to locate the speaker as well as the audience of the poem. Now, generally we assume that the reader is the audience of the poem. We are the audience of the poem, because we seem to identify that the poem is addressed to us as it is read by us. But within the immediate setting of the poem might be addressed to some particular person. For example, Donne's poem Valediction Forbidding Mourning, in which the conceit of a compass is used, that is addressed to his beloved, the wife, for whom he wrote the poem at the time of departure from the city to another city. So that was the immediate audience of the poem. In the particular setting of the poem, it was the poet or the speaker within the poem writing to the beloved. Now, in every poem, the speaker might address multiple or different people. There might be a conversation or a kind of a dialogue taking place in a dramatic monologue, and then the poem might be objectively addressing somebody, that is maybe addressed to the sun, addressed to a friend, addressed to the nation, addressed to the soldiers, addressed to the politicians, or to the students, or to the children. There can be many settings in a poem in which you can locate the listener or the person to whom the poem is addressed, and that is the immediate context of the poem which determines to whom the poem is addressed. As we readers feel that the poem is addressed to us, but we are an audience that lies outside the text, who receive the text as a product. But within the specific context or setting or situation in the poem, there might be a very immediate audience to whom it would be addressed. For example, the way I mentioned that Donne's poem Valediction Forbidding Mourning is addressed to Donne's or this persona's beloved or the wife. Similarly, if we read W.B. Yeats's poem, here we would notice that in the Second Coming, he addresses the audience as the whole Christian community, whom he is addressing to be getting astray from the path of the Christ, or forgetting the teaching of the religion. Now, in another poem, we might come across a speaker addressing a friend, or addressing the children, or addressing the scholars or the students. Now, there are many ways that a writer can change a situation depending upon for whom the poem is written. Now, as we are analyzing Dylan Thomas's poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, to locate the very immediate audience and the speaker of the poem, setting of the poem, persona of the poem, and mood of the poem, we are supposed to look at the poem quite critically and minutely. Our observation would distill what the poem is about. That would be the identification of the subject matter or theme. Then we will identify who the speaker is and who the listener or implied audience is. Then we will see what is the mood, tone of the poem, setting or situation of the poem. Then we will also look at the devices used, the syntax order, the rhyme, the meter, and the balance of the poem. Now, these steps would be taken one by one to describe what the poem looks like, or how is it composed, and what meanings and messages does it give to the reader. So as a literary critic or as a student of literature, this is what we distill out of the poem's reading, that we find that Dylan Thomas is a very passionate writer or poet who has given quite a severe and extreme force to his writing that shows the intense display of emotions and feelings. We find an immediacy and urgency, a force and emotional intensity because of the use of the words that he has made in the poem. For example, when he begins, "Do not go gentle into that good night," that very first line is forceful as it is a command, as it is forbidding somebody from doing something or taking an action. Then the words like "rage, rage against the dying of the light," against shows the exasperation, the intensity of anger and emotional force. Then again, the repetition of the same at the end of every line, "rage, rage against the dying of the light." Then again, "do not go gentle into that good night," the command repeated. And then repetition of the same line, "rage, rage against the dying of the light." Now, these sentences like "do not go gentle into that good night," "rage, rage against the dying of the light," and then repetition of "do not go gentle into that good night," these repetitions reflect that this is a way or a mode of foregrounding. The writer has foregrounded an idea that is there in the title as well. "Do not go gentle into that good night." Apart from that, "rage, rage against the dying of the light." Now, the repetition of these two lines makes these lines become the very focus and highlight of the poem. Hence, we say that it has been foregrounded within the poem. So it is the example of parallelism, what we studied in our lectures, that parallelism is the creation of regularity with the help of the repetition of the words, which might occur or reoccur in a text in order to reinforce an idea into the reader's mind. In order to make the reader understand the significance of some idea, the writer chooses to repeat certain things. And when he makes use of such repetitions, the motive of the writer or the poet is that the reader must remember it and he must not forget it. So it adds to memorability. If we read the poem once, we would remember its title because it has been repeated at the end of every stanza. It occurs in the beginning, in the first line of the first stanza. Then in the second stanza, it is the last line. Then the same is repeated in the fourth stanza's last line. And then the repetition of the line "rage, rage," it occurs at the end of the first stanza. Then it occurs at the end of the third stanza. And then it occurs at the end of the last stanza. Now, "do not go gentle into that good night" and "rage, rage against the dying of the light" are the examples of parallelism, where the writer makes use of repetition in order to reinforce the idea, in order to make us remember something that he considered important. Now, observe the first line of the poem, that is, "Do not go gentle into that good night." That is also the title of the poem. Now, the poem's beginning or the first line is in the form of a command. It is imperative mode that the writer has used. Now, it adds to the directness and immediacy, that as if somebody like a teacher, like an instructor, or like somebody who is warning us, is addressing us and is forbidding us from doing something. He says, "Do not go gentle into that good night." Now, another important thing that complicates the first line is the phrase "good night." Now, when we read the first line, we are interested to know what the good night means, what the good night refers to. Now, usually we use good night as an expression, as a kind of, you can say, wish to a person. Just the way we say good morning, we say good night, so that a person has sweet dreams and he has a very pleasant sleep. So we wish somebody good night, or just the way we wish somebody good morning. But here, good night is not a wish. Rather, it really makes us feel, surprised that the speaker is warning somebody not to go gentle into good night. Rather than only night, he is forbidding the reader or the listener not to go gently, calmly, quietly into good night. Now, we stop over here as we feel that apart from the repetition, that is the feature of parallelism used in the poem in the form of do not go gentle into that good night's repetition at every stanza, and rage, rage against the dying of the lights repetition in every stanza. That is identified by us as a foregrounded feature that is done with the help of parallelism or repetition of words. Now that we see that good night is something ambiguous, we know good night as a wish, but here good night seems to be some place, some situation, or some condition. That is what creates problems for the reader. We stop, we are surprised, and we think what it means. So it becomes a deviation. When a reader is forced to stop and think, he is given a shock, he is given a surprise, and ultimately he is forced to focus on what is the meaning of a phrase or a word. So this is the element of surprise and interest that we identified that was linked with deviation. Now, how is it deviation? Because it is euphemism. Now, we identify it as a very specific literary device used by the author to create deviation. And the deviation is creating foregrounded effect, or the effect of foregrounding. And what is the deviation? If you specifically want to know what it is, the expression good night is euphemism. Now, euphemism means substituting a soft expression or phrase or word for something harsh. Now, the word good night, as the understanding of the poem reveals to us, refers to death. Now, night is often referred to as something that brings end of the day. So metaphorically, the night that may occur in life would be darkness of death, the end of life, as night is the end of the day. Similarly, night in life would be death. So the idea of death, instead of referring to it directly, that do not go gentle into the valley of death, into the realm of death, that wouldn't have been very artistic, that wouldn't have been really literary. So the writer has come up with a very deviant and artistic a way to give expression to something that we know about, that is horrible, that is harsh, that is cruel, as it is death that snatches away pleasures, youth, beauty, and our loved ones. So the command given by the speaker in the very start of the poem is, do not accept death quietly. That is what he means to say. So the expression or the phrase good night is a euphemism. Hence it is a deviation because it changes meaning. We know the meaning of the good night as a wish, but in which meaning it is used over here, if it is different, that means death, not a wish for good night when you would wake up from the sleep. Now this sleep wouldn't let you wake up, as it is death. So the speaker or the persona in the poem is referring to death as good night. And this is how we see that in the very first line of the poem, we have found deviation in both the forms, in the form of parallelism, in the form of deviation, that is, use of a literary device called euphemism. And euphemism means replacing a harsh word with a mild one. For example, when you say that somebody has, passed away, or he has gone to an eternal sleep, now these expressions are also euphemism. If you say he's, gone to eternal sleep, or he has passed away, or he has expired, you are using or substituting a mild word for something that is harsh, like death. He has died, he is no more. is quite brutal, stark, harsh and direct. So you say that somebody has gone to eternal sleep, somebody has passed away or expired. So similarly, good night over here replaces the harsh word death with good night, which we were familiar with as a wish. But now the reader's perceptions are challenged, and we get a surprise that the expression good night can also be used in some other meaning. That is, that it is replacing death with night. Then in the second line, he says, old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Now, referring to the old age as an older person, they should burn and rave at close of day. Now, close of day is again a euphemistic expression. Why is it a euphemistic expression? Because close of the day is again referring to end of life. So instead of saying end of life, the closure of life, the old age, or the time when a person is about to die, that would appear to be too brutal, harsh and stark a reality. So it has been replaced with close of day. Close of day, end of day. And day is used as a kind of synecdoche, the literary device that we studied about, that day is a part of a person's life. So when part is taken as a whole, there is a relationship of part and whole in this, so it is a synecdoche where day stands for the whole life. It's not the end of one day of a person's life, rather here it is being used as a synecdoche that is referring to the part of the whole life, and part of the whole life is a single day. Then rage, rage against the dying of the light. Now we find repetition again, not only on the word rage that is repeated twice, but also on the line that would be repeated in the third stanza and in the fifth stanza as well. So in the very first stanza, the 3 lines, see how if you look quite minutely and critically at poems or lines, you find some very interesting use of either literary devices, deviations, parallelism or foreground features. So we have identified that from the perspective of grammar and syntax. Further, we can highlight that the first sentence of the poem is imperative, in imperative mode, as it is a command in which the speaker is forbidding the listener or the reader to accept something quietly or humbly. Then if we have identified parallelism in the form of repetition of words and lines, not only in the poem in the form of the repetition of the first and the last line of the first stanza, but also repetition of the words rage, rage, and also in the first line, see, there is repetition of the sound that is go, gentle, good night. So in those words like go, gentle, good night, we find the repetition. And then the word rage, rage also is a repetition that shows the exasperation, the anger, the frustration, and the sort of, you can say, opposition from the speaker, that he is opposing something that is inevitable and more real, that is death. Now the second stanza, though wise men at their end work, though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Now see that we find sort of antithesis, we find sort of you can say opposition in the words as well. For example, in the first stanza there is a contrast or there is antithesis between the word night and the word day, and then the word night and the word light. So observe that the word gentle is antithetical to the word rage. So within the first stanza you can also identify the use of antithesis. For example, gentle contrasts with the word rage. then the word night contrasts with the word day, and then the word night also contrasts with the word light. So here the use of antithesis or opposite words also signifies a sort of a battle or a sort of an opposition or a sort of you can say contradiction that is going on within the mind of the speaker, that he is sort of in a mood of a battle or waging a war against something that he cannot fight or beat, but still he is not ready to give up, though he knows that night or death would take over the day and life, and he's going gentle into the night should turn into rage and fury, and he should not accept it because death seems to show its power and control over human life, and anyone who is either powerful or rich, wealthy or brave has to submit before death. But the speaker seems to say that why death snatches away everything from us, why is it so powerful and so much furious. So here we see that the words that are antithetical, like night and day, night and light, gentle and rage, create the same opposition, they create the same contradiction that is going on as a battle in the mind of the speaker, who is highlighting the fact that how strange it is that no power, no control, and no action against death can become fruitful or useful. Observe the second stanza too. There too you find a use of antithesis. For example, the way he says, wise men at their end know dark is right. Now this seems to be paradox. As we identified in our understanding of different tropes, that antithesis is in the form of two opposite words or contradictory words that may occur in a closer proximity within a stanza, within a line, but they might not be joined together. Now this idea in the line that wise men know at their end that dark is right. How can dark be right? We know dark to be wrong, as dark is evil, dark is corruption, dark is mostly connected with something bad, ominous or evil. But here the speaker says dark is right. Now this paradox becomes clear or believable when we see that dark is death, that death is right, death is inevitable, and death is the only thing that can happen when a person reaches the old age. So in this way the paradox becomes clear, something that we find is contradictory to our view, because we know dark is wrong, as dark is evil, dark symbolizes corruption, dark symbolizes something bad, ominous. But here dark is right is a contradiction or a paradox. How does the dark become right? Because that is what is needed at the time of old age. The death is what would bring a beginning of another, a life. So in that way it becomes right. If death is the beginning, then only it is right. If it is the end, of course, then it is wrong, then it is atrocious. Because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Now, again, we find in the second line of the second stanza a sort of selection, restriction, rule violation. Remember, we studied it in our very early lectures, that how the grammatical violation or selection, restriction, rule violation is part of anything that is poetry, because it may show initially the madness of the author, that why is he using something with what it cannot be connected. For example, if you say that the sky is crying, that is the selection, restriction, rule violation, because sky doesn't have eyes like a human being, it cannot cry. But here also, words forked no lightning. Now we know that words are sounds, words are not visuals. Like light is emitted from either sun or moon or from the bulbs or tube lights. But here words had forked no lightning is an example of selection, restriction, rule violation, because we expect words to emit sound, expression, language, verbal expression. It is not connected with a visual like light. It should have been correct if the writer has used that the lights or the bulbs or the sun has forked no lightning. But instead of the sun or the bulb, he says, words had forked no lightning. That from the words of wise men, there has been no light. Or more importantly, how this selection, restriction and violation rule becomes plausible, understandable or agreeable is that words of wisdom show light, guidance and path. So when we look at this from the metaphorical perspective, that selection, restriction, rule, violation becomes plausible. The words may not emit light as an image, but words have light or power of light to guide us, to enlighten us, to show us light and path and guidance or enlightenment. That is how we say that words have light. Then repetition of the same first line of the very poem, that is, do not go gentle into that good night. Again the command restricting us from following something blindly or going to accept something quite submissively. So see these three lines in the first stanza and the three lines in the second stanza, how much forceful they have been, and our understanding of the lines exposed to us many intricacies of the composition of the writing. Here you see that the same antithetical expressions have been used, like dark and night are contrasting against each other, and we find that the writer has used the same method in the composition of the lines as well, that the last line of the second stanza is the repetition of the first line of the first stanza, whereas the rage that occurs in the third line of the first stanza is repeated in the last line of the third stanza. So he makes use of it in the same place again in the third stanza. Now let us look at the very idea that how the poet composes the poem, what would be its effect on the reader. Now that we have seen the two stanzas of the poem in which we find firstly a command which is forbidding the reader or some listener to accept death calmly or quietly. It is commanding or giving advice to take arms against death's cruelty, go quite bravely to face it rather than submissively and weakly. Then it also says that death is something inevitable, that even wise men's sayings haven't really enlightened their paths, and we cannot really go to accept death calmly or quietly. So we see that in this poem the idea is very unique. The idea also seems to be very much perplexing and confusing, that instead of submitting before death, the poet is giving the idea of taking arms against death. So if we look at this stanza, that is, wise men at their end know dark is right. Because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Now these lines are potentially quite confusing, and what confusion is there? The confusion is about the words of the wise men and also about the right that is about the darkness. Now we find that Dylan Thomas's sentence, even though smart people know, intelligent people know or wise people know that death is inevitable, they don't just accept it and let themselves fade away, because they may not have achieved everything that they were expecting to achieve in their lives. So the idea that even the wise men, the smart men or the more knowledgeable men too feel that death has come quite abruptly, quickly or unexpectedly before they have achieved something in their life, is what shows the idea which contrasts with the speaker's idea of taking arms against death or fighting against death. So here he is justifying that death couldn't be evaded or escaped even by the wise men or smart men who knew what they are going to do in their life, who had a plan or a very much defined chart about their life. If the wise men or the intelligent men could not take arms against death, could not defeat or really you can say beat death, then it means that the speaker's effort to force somebody to take arms against death, show rage against death, would too be futile. So it shows the irony that he is admitting that even the wise men could not escape death. Then how can he or the person whom he is asking to fight against death would be able to escape death? So this shows a contradiction within the poem, that the experience of the speaker, the knowledge of the speaker, has already taught him that death is inevitable, that is very much there for everyone, either wise or otherwise. So we say that line 3, line 4 and this of this stanza, they reveal that it's not the idea of practically being able to defeat death, but it is just a thought, it is just a wish, it is just a longing, that one thing that he thinks is his enemy or foe or opponent is death. So here death is playing the role of an antagonist, and the protagonist, the speaker, seems to know that death is a strong antagonist against whom he cannot really fight, but still he is looking at the prospects through which he can defeat it. But his knowledge and experience about the past and the people tells him that even the wise men were unable to defeat death. Now, stylistically looking at the very phrase of the wise men, we see that it is a reference to a group of people, sages, prophets, scholars. Now, he doesn't say that one person belonging to this class, for example, a poet, a writer, or a scholar, he has, been aware that dark is right. He says wise men. Now, who can be wise men? There can be many, professions. There can be many groups of people who may be, encompassed within the category of wise men. These might be the scholars. These might be the teachers. These might be the sages, prophets, seers, who are wise men. And then, if we say that these were the seers or prophets who were wise men, and they too had to taste death, they couldn't to escape death, then the idea of lightning makes sense, because mostly with prophets and sages we associate the idea of light of reasoning, the light of knowledge that has been emitted and transmitted to them through God or through the intuition. So the light of reasoning is what the wise men are capable of. So we find a sort of semantic relationship or connection of the phrase wise men with the word right, as well as with the word light, and also the word gentle and good. So wise men are connected with these notions, the notion of right, the notion of lightning, the notion of gentleness, and the notion of good. So we see that how within this stanza certain words have got a particular connection or relationship and fall within the same category. So this is how the lines that we have observed reveal to us the potential that stylistic analysis has for the revelation of meaning. Now, we haven't really looked at the general overall meaning, the location of the speaker, the setting of the speaker, who the listener is, what is the tone. Rather, we started from the scratch, we started from the minute points and intricate details. Then we would come to the broader understanding of the text. So this is, you can say, sort of bottom-up approach. A bottom-up approach means that going to the details first and then making generalizations or broader views and observations about a poem. So if you make a generalization about the poem, that a poem is written by the poet to his friend, to his beloved, to his father, and in which he is advising somebody not to accept death, and he is pessimistic in his mood and he is furious in his mood, that would not justify your understanding. Why? Because first analyze the words. First, analyze the composition, the syntax, the grammar, the semantics, identify the devices like schemes and tropes, deviations, and then point out what are the foreground irregularities or irregularities within the text. So that is how your analysis will be considered to be a scientific and stylistic analysis. So in the analysis of the first two stanzas, we have observed that how are we supposed to look at each and every word, find out its morphological, phonological order, balance, its semantic value, its connection within the statement or within a sentence as well as within a stanza, and how words belonging to a particular or same semantic field create meaning. Then how do they deviate or create opposition with the help of either antithesis and contrast, oxymoron, or even paradox. Then how do they make use of a particular sort of a grammar or tense, either it is the ing form of verb used, or is it the indefinite form of the word used, and then the repetition of sounds and words as well. So we have been doing that for the sake of performing a stylistic analysis in order to avoid any generalization about the text. So we do not go to any sources, the way I in the beginning of the course of stylistics told you that stylistic analysis is different from the analysis that we have or you have performed up till now about literary texts, that it avoids generalization. Now, we do not know who Dylan Thomas is, whether he's a Victorian poet, whether he is a Renaissance poet, or whether he's a modern poet or a romantic poet. We did not look at that. Neither did we look at which particular place, region, country did he belong to. We haven't read any of his other poems. So we are completely unaware of what type of poems does he write, what type of life did he lead. So we kind of separated ourselves from the associations that the writer has with either place or even his philosophical or psychological bent of mind. So we start our analysis by focusing on the text. So this is a text-centered analysis that stylistics focuses on, that putting the author or the poet's personality aside, we only look at what the text reveals. And this would be what the writers also desire to be done to their works. Because if we associate everything with the writer's personality, the meanings of the poems would be limited. But when we focus on the words, diction, language, grammar, deviations, parallelism, or certain devices being used by the writer, we are able to make such judgments and analysis which are more broader, which are more interesting, as well as more revealing. So that is why we in stylistics focus on style, focus on text, and we focus on language rather than the poet. We do not find the poet's personality or the poet's experience within the poem or a text. We find what experience we gain by the expressions that have been used by the poet, by the language that has been used by the poet. So this is how we would keep on performing a stylistic analysis. So we have done the analysis of two stanzas in today's lecture. In the next lecture, we will continue with our analysis, which would lead us from the text-centered analysis to a more broader and rigorous stylistic analysis, finding out the theme and even locating the literary devices within the text. So in the next lecture, we will continue the analysis of the same poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, and see what the rest of the three stanzas reveal about the poem. Thank you.